My name is Maria Garzón Maceda. I'm the project coordinator for the CBW workstream at UNIDIR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. I'm glad to welcome you all to this event on options for BWC verification. To provide just a very brief context to this, last year in December, at the working group meeting, states parties had a session on compliance and verification, and they seemed to be in what Richard Guthrie, you may know him, described as the early stages of conceptual thinking about verification. There were definitely differing views on a number of points, including the focus and function of verification. It was clear then, and it is clear now, as it's expressed in working papers and in many interventions that we had heard from delegations in the last couple of days, that we need greater clarity and convergence in the conceptual understandings of verification's scope and purpose. As you may know, I hope, UNIDIR has been working on the topic of BWC verification for some time now. This includes research through publications and also discussions with experts, for example, through our UNIDIR Global Disarmament Research Network. You can see our most recent publications on the topic of verification in the flyer that was just outside the room, and it's also outside the meeting room of the working group, or through the links that my colleagues are sharing in the chat right now. In the past weeks, we just published 2 papers. The first one by Dr. James Revel focuses on possible models for verification under the BWC beyond the traditional model that we usually have in mind when thinking about this. And in the latest paper we published, we meant to address the points of conceptual thinking around the focus and function of verification. This report brings together views of 4 international experts: Dr. Ajay Lele from India, Dr. Jeremy Littlewood from Canada, Dr. Anastasia Maligina from the Russian Federation, and Mr. Matthew Scherer from the US. We asked each of them to respond to 3 key questions. The first, what do you understand by the term BWC verification? The second, what is the purpose of BWC verification? And the third one, what do we want to verify? Of course, the answers to these questions from the experts in the paper present their own personal views. So for this event today, what we're going to do is discuss some of the perspectives and perhaps touch upon some of the implications of some recent developments we've had in this area. And we will hear from speakers and then have a Q&A session. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, your comments, your questions. And if you are joining us online, please use the Q&A function that you can find on WebEx at the bottom of your screen, I think. We'll get to those. You can write them at any time. So I'm glad to be joined today by 2 of the authors of these publications that I just mentioned. For really brief introduction, Matthew here is an associate scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and a senior research associate in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you for joining us. Our other speaker is James Revel. You might know him. He is the head of the WMD and space security programs at UNIDIR. And his expertise focuses on the BWC, not to say he is a BWC nerd. And to kick us off with our discussions and provide some introductory remarks, I'm delighted to also welcome one of the friends of the chair on this topic of verification and compliance, Alonso Martinez-Ruiz. You are very familiar with Alonso, I guess. But for the others, Alonso is a counselor at the Mission of Mexico and a BWC veteran at this point, I guess. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, Alonso. Tienes la palabra.
First and foremost, I would like to thank UNIDIR for organizing this side event on the options for BWC verification, which certainly tackles one of the most critical aspects on the strengthening of the BWC. I thank you for inviting me to give some introductory remarks, which I do as a friend of the chair, which I have an appointment which I have the honor to share with Ambassador Indenbosch of Netherlands. Obviously, I think this side event reflects on the value of UNIDIR in the field of disarmament in general, but more particular in tackling and gathering expertise on the most challenging issues for the disarmament, in this case, verification and compliance of the BWC. So the establishment of the working group was an enormous accomplishment. Even in a complex and contested political environment, we could reach consensus to promote cooperation and strengthen the convention to address the challenges posed by the biological landscape of the 21st century. So now it falls in states and other stakeholders, like the experts that are presenting this study, to make the best use of this mechanism to identify, develop, and recommend measures in different aspects, including on verification. And we particularly welcome the debate on the 3 questions that you have highlighted in your presentations, and I think that have also been areas of concerns by delegations in the discussions and the working papers. We obviously have heard of the need to understand what the term of verification on the framework of BWC is. I think in general, there's an appreciation that verification is a means through which a judgment and compliance is made. So that verification is a process and the compliance is the requirement. But I think beyond the generality and going into the nuances, there clearly has been a need to recognize what it would mean and to operationalize such term. What does it imply in the gathering of information related to the fulfillment of an obligation, on data analysis, interpretation and evaluation, or making compliance assessments? Also, the purposes of the BWC verification, I think, while there is the overall understanding that it is to strengthen the compliance by deterring potential non-compliers of the key norm of prohibiting biological and toxical weapons, there are clearly other specific purposes that have been highlighted, from aiming to increase trust, avoiding misunderstandings, dispelling misgivings, and create safeguards for the developments of peaceful use, and to address non-compliance and even attribution of responsibility. So within these broad parameters of operationalization, I think there is much more need to understand how they interact, if they are complementary, and I think this is one of the aspects I think it's important to further highlight. And obviously, there's also the question of what to verify. And here, in the dynamic and exponentially advancing field of life science and technology, this becomes a fundamental question. What is the bio-risks? How can we understand the bio-risks today? And even more essentially, the conceptual nature of biological weapons. And I think these are fundamental questions that need to be further understood. And I think studies like this, for me, that I'm a diplomat, obviously I can help the chair guide the work going forward, but I think it's by encouraging substantive scientific technical studies of these issues that we will really get the sufficient mass of knowledge necessary to make concrete advancements towards the strengthening of the convention. So I welcome this event and certainly will listen carefully to the presentations.
Thank you very much, Alonso. I think you already provided some definitions or certain answers to some of the questions we were thinking about, and that you, as friends of the chair, have also posed to states parties, right? So that's super interesting, and you have your work cut out for the coming months, I think, on these challenging but very important topic. So thank you very much. So now I would think I'll turn to our panel to get us started, and perhaps, Jamie, I'll start with you. I've referred to our latest paper that collects experts' views on certain questions on the focus and functions of verification. Perhaps you can kick us off by providing a little bit of context to this paper, as well as specifically share what was the input of the experts on the question of what do they understand by BWC verification. The floor is yours.
Maria, thanks also to Alonso for joining on the panel. And thank you all for coming. It has been towards the end of a long week, at the end of what feels like a very long year. And I'm sure some of you, like me, probably have slight fatigue with plastic wrapped sandwiches. So thank you for coming and spending your lunchtime with us. It's much appreciated. We've heard quite a lot on the topic of compliance and verification over the last couple of days, but I was particularly struck by some of the discussions, some of the working papers on this topic, pointing to that need to understand and have a clearer sense of focus and function. So the French, Belgium, Moroccan paper refers to verification as a long-term process that requires a prior definition of shared principles and aims. The paper by Germany states that in order to be successful, it will be essential for states parties to reach common understanding of the prohibitions and to agree on the aims and objectives, the scope, as well as the object and purpose of such a regime first before considering specific measures. I think this was reflected in statements by other states as well. It seems an important starting point to have at least convergence or greater common understanding around scope and key concepts. This was also something that struck us in the discussion that we've had, including through UNIDIR's Global Disarmament Research Network. And it's something that really came out when we entered this discussion, is if you want to look at models, if you want to look at tools, technologies, opportunities, you kind of need to have an idea of where to point those tools and technologies. So we sought the views of a number of experts in this area, and as Maria said, we asked them questions around the focus and the function of BWC verification. Just as a spoiler alert, there is no single coherent answer for you here, nor would this necessarily be helpful in these discussions. I think this is something which I think is important for states to collectively determine. So what we have instead is some food for thought. Matt, of course, can speak for himself and his views, but I'll present some of the other contributions that we've had this, and beginning with Dr. Anastasia Maligina, who's an associate professor at St. Petersburg State University, and she views BWC verification as, and I quote, a set of methods, tools, and procedures that have been agreed upon by consensus and are used to verify compliance of states with their obligations under the BWC. Notably, she also makes the distinction between verification mechanisms and enhanced transparency. Now, another author of ours, Ajay Lele, is Deputy Director of the Manal Parakir Institute of Defence Studies and Analysis in India, also draws from recent discussions, including the Nuclear Disarmament Verification group of governmental experts, to lay out a sort of understanding of verification as a process collectively agreed of gathering and analysing information to enable an assessment of compliance, adding this process must also not affect peaceful research, which I think is an important point to keep in mind. I think both these approaches are perhaps more consistent with this, what you could see as a traditional approach to verification. I think something which is also reflected in some of the working papers. And this is one approach. Dr. Jeremy Littlewood was another one of the experts who contributed and takes a little bit of a different stand on this, seeing verification as a process, but arguing it may be an excuse me, it may be a national undertaking, a regional or like-minded approach, or an agreed set of rules, procedures, and practices accepted by all states parties to the BWC. Notably, in his thinking, it does not have to be reciprocal, non-discriminatory, or equitable, since the structured process to assess implementation and compliance of one state's party may not be the same process for another state party. I know Matt has different views again, so I'll stop there and hand back to you, Maria, but it gives you a little bit of a flavour of the paper and some of the different perspectives on that first question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for providing that overview. And indeed, I'm going to turn now to you, Matt, for your views on how do you understand verification under the BWC.
All right, thank you. And thank you to UNIDIR for the opportunity to participate in today's panel. So as Maria said, I'm Matt Shear from the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and I'm part of a team who's been working on what we call BWC assurance. We've been thinking about issues around BWC verification and compliance for several years now, including in the lead up to the 9th Review Conference. The main purpose of our original BWC assurance study was to better understand issues around compliance and verification, particularly with respect to their purpose and scope. We wanted to stimulate thinking and debate about these important concepts, and it's been encouraging that states parties are starting to grapple with these ideas in the plenary sessions. There remains a wide divergence in the perspectives around verification and compliance, including with respect to the role of increased transparency versus the objective evidence for compliance, as well as the role of various treaty obligations. So following that study, I've been playing around with an idea, an alternative model for verification in an effort to help address some of the foundational, fundamental and practical challenges around that concept. So please keep in mind, this is still a work in progress. Also, this does not represent the official position of my center, the United States, or really anyone else. So verification and compliance assessment are often discussed together, and sometimes even as the same concept. But what if they're not? I wondered what would happen if we addressed verification and compliance assessment separately. So in this approach, we separate verification and compliance assessment and each has their own specific purpose and scope. In this model, verification would focus on states parties' implementation of their treaty obligations and broadly cover all of those obligations. And in contrast, compliance assessment would focus on the nature of biological activities, specifically whether they are permitted or prohibited with respect to the obligations laid out in Articles 1 through 3. So rather than addressing these two different purposes and scopes together, separating them could enable states parties to apply different activities and standards to each of them individually. And this flexibility could help address multiple priorities for the BWC and states parties, including to ensure the full and effective implementation of the convention across all obligations, increasing transparency and assurance that biology is not being used for prohibited purposes, and to evaluate the nature of biological activities with respect to BWC prohibitions. I know this is considerably different than the conventional concept of verification and compliance, and to some degree that's the point. So I'll encourage you to please keep an open mind as I walk through my thought process. To me, this all starts with the definition of verification. I tend to think about the term in a traditional sense. To me, verification needs to be rooted somehow in the gathering of objective evidence in order to determine some kind of truth. From my perspective, if there's nothing concrete to verify, then we should be using a different term. Importantly, however, this definition still provides states parties with a lot of flexibility with regard to how verification applies to the convention. I frequently hear delegations and other stakeholders use the phrase verify states parties compliance, but frankly, I'm not a big fan of that terminology. To me, the problem is that states parties compliance would need to apply broadly across all of their biological activities. Considering the volume and diversity of these activities, it's impossible or at least impractical to determine compliance for all biological activities in a single country, let alone across all states parties. So to me, verifying compliance for states parties isn't a realistic goal. Instead, my model applies compliance assessment in a narrower context. So rather than trying to address all biological capabilities and activities, compliance assessment would apply to individual biological activities, facilities, programs, or events. So by limiting the scope in this way, compliance assessment becomes a much more concrete and manageable task. It's at least feasible that states parties could investigate for example, a single facility and determine whether it's in compliance with the obligations laid out in Articles 1 through 3. Or in other words, whether those activities at that facility are permitted or prohibited under the BWC. We can't possibly eliminate the risk of biological weapons, for example, by verifying the compliance of all biological activities, but we can mitigate it. And just because we can't verify compliance, that doesn't mean there's nothing to verify. So one option to mitigate these bioweapons risks is by ensuring that states parties are fully and effectively implementing their treaty obligations. And that's how I envision the purpose of verification in this model I've developed. Fortunately, treaty implementation can potentially give us some set of concrete activities and standards against which to verify participation. If we can determine and demonstrate that states parties are, one, committed to implementing their treaty obligations, and two, capable of doing so, it could provide assurance that their biological activities are in compliance with treaty prohibitions. So in this model, verifying effective treaty implementation could serve as an analog or a proxy for a state's parties compliance. So with that, I'll hand things back to Maria.
Thank you, Matt, for laying out your model. Super interesting. And again, this is one perspective on this issue. We're very much aware. Sorry about that. I hope you were able to hear me. I was just thanking Matt for sharing his model on BWC verification, which is one of the options and one of the thinking process around all of this. With that, I think I'll turn again to both of the panelists to ask about the issue of the focus of verification now. What should we be looking for? Perhaps, Matt, I can turn to you first, and then I'll turn to Jamie.
Sure, thank you. So first off, I don't think that there exists a prototypical model of a biological weapons program. An offensive program or offensive biological program could take countless forms depending on the purpose, the resources and scale, the organization, the complexity. And so trying to model something after a hypothetical program could be problematic. And the dual use nature of biology makes it extremely difficult in some cases to distinguish between legitimate and prohibited biological activities. And in some cases, the activities themselves might not even be the issue, but rather the intent of those activities. So it may not be practical to design a verification or compliance assessment program with a specific model in mind, because it risks not capturing programs that exist or take another form or another format. And so if we don't have a specific program in mind on which to develop a verification regime, how would states parties design one? And in my model, because verification focuses on treaty implementation, and importantly, this needs to include something that's verifiable. So unfortunately, the treaty text isn't really helpful in that regard. It obviously lays out a set of obligations, but the language isn't specific or concrete enough in order to enforce those obligations. So the BWC would need something like a treaty protocol to establish the activities, documentation, and standards necessary to operationalize those treaty obligations, including to address things like national legislation and regulatory systems, international cooperation and response, declarations or other reporting requirements, site visits or inspections, and financial contributions. This could provide a set of concrete metrics against which to verify a state's parties' implementation of their treaty obligations. Achieving these standards would enable a state party to demonstrate both that it has committed to and is able to implement its treaty obligations. And it would provide an associated increase in transparency regarding biological activities, facilities, and programs. Full implementation of treaty obligations based on this established set of standards would increase confidence and trust, which again could serve as an analog or a proxy for treaty compliance. And this could facilitate an environment, ideally this would facilitate an environment in which states parties can leverage biology to the fullest extent for peaceful purposes, which is, at the end of the day, one of the principal goals of the treaty. The model could have some additional benefits, such as tying treaty implementation to verification rather than compliance, could help avoid some issues around judging states parties as non-compliant while they're still building or scaling up their national implementation. And identifying gaps in national implementation through this verification process could provide opportunities and flag needs for further international cooperation and assistance. And so just to wrap up, separating verification and compliance could provide an opportunity to address some of the key aspects of verification debate, including some that we heard during the working group meetings this week. In particular, it could help establish a concrete set of verifiable requirements, balance calls for a comprehensive approach across all treaty obligations and a focus on non-proliferation and disarmament components of the treaty, and to increase transparency and assurance while also providing an opportunity for a more concrete compliance assessment regarding biological activities. It's entirely possible that we'll never be able to generate enough assurance or confidence or certainty or whatever term you prefer with respect to treaty states parties compliance, but maybe that's not a realistic goal. Maybe verifying implementation for a set of designated activities or standards or requirements could strike a reasonable balance between increasing assurance and the resources and effort needed to achieve it. So with that, I'll hand things back to Maria.
Thanks, Matt. I think you made two very valid points. I mean, that we all have in mind that what would a biological weapons program look like today? We are not entirely sure. And also that we might not be 100% certain on assessments. So with that, I think I'll turn to you, Jamie, with the same question about the focus of verification, and if you could present some of the wider issues around this topic.
Many thanks, Maria. I do think this is a really interesting question, and I agree with Matt. There's no prototypical biological weapons program. I think you can envisage a lot of, in the past indeed, very different programs with very different footprints. I was struck over the course of this week, we often hear the phrase that form follows function. Arguably, I think when we're looking at trying to develop a verification mechanism as well, form probably also has to follow focus as well. Because there are lots of exciting tools, procedures, and approaches that you could apply to build confidence in compliance and perhaps verify the BWC. But at the same time, we have to be able to point those tools and develop those procedures to address what I hope would be some sort of collective threat assessment on this. To put it otherwise, and perhaps more bluntly, we need to have some sort of shared understanding of what the needles in the haystack actually look like. And in developing this, I think we need to be quite careful in the assumptions that we build this on. I draw from some of the comments from the authors here to elaborate on this a little bit, but Ajay, for example, has indicated that determining what to verify is a technical, challenging subject, because biological weapons can take many different forms, and biological weapons programs can have different footprints, including footprints that will not necessarily resemble other WMD programs. It's not always clear what to look for and how we should focus any verification-related mechanism. To also provide some comments from Anastasia, who points out that since the BWC entered into force in 1975, there has been a significant miniaturization and improvement of laboratories and production equipment. This equipment is now standardized and widely used in educational research and in industrial settings. There's also growing concern over the do-it-yourself bio movement as well, and a number of other different areas. Okay. In addition to this, three sort of points from my side, which are not in the paper, but I think I've probably mentioned these several times to the point where I'm starting to become a bit tedious or more tedious, depending on your view. But first, I think when we look at these things, it is important to take into consideration new high-tech approaches, but also we shouldn't lose sight of potential old or scruffy technologies and their application in the development of biological weapons. So the chemical weapons used in the last decade typically don't seem to be particularly high-tech or new. My second point is that I think a lot of the thinking and the assumption tend to gravitate towards humans. We also perhaps don't lose sight of the potential for biological weapons for use against animals and plants. And indeed, many of the programs of the past seem to typically include an animal or plant component for purposes of economic sabotage, among other things. My third point is that sometimes during discussions around biological weapons, we often think of all biological weapons as being weapons of mass destruction, but that really isn't the case. Biological weapons can have a range of utilities, and I think keeping some of the possible utilities in mind is also important when we start looking at measures to prevent biological weapons, but also to detect and to build confidence in compliance. I'll stop there. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Jamie, for reminding us some of those issues that sometimes are not in the front of minds. And also, I liked your phrase about forms follows focus. So I think we can keep that for the records. Anyway, assuming that states parties eventually can agree on focus, on scope, on functions, what models are available for them to consider or to develop, actually. I already mentioned UNIDIR published a paper on this, possible models of verification for the BWC. So Jamie, perhaps I can continue with you. If you could walk us through the different models that are presented in the paper.
Thank you, Maria. There's not actually a great deal to say on this. I think the paper is actually fairly simple and self-explanatory. But the idea going into this is that we have tended to gravitate towards a particular approach or model or way of thinking around BWC verification. I think that's entirely understandable. This is the approach used in the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's the approach discussed in the Biological Weapons Convention protocol negotiations. It's often seen as the standard, indeed by some, the gold standard for verification models. But at the same time, it's not the only or the exclusive possible approach to verifying the BWC. I think depending on what you're trying to achieve, depending on how you define verification and the expectations associated with that, there could be other approaches. And I think we've started to see this emerging in some of the working papers that have been discussed, the different approaches and different components that could be added. So we tried to break this down into a couple of different illustrative sort of categories or clusters of things. So in addition to the traditional approach, there's also something termed verification light, which contains many of those traditional approaches, but also looks at the integration of visits as a substitute for routine inspections. I should add, in the protocol negotiations, the term inspections was actually replaced by visits in the latter part of those discussions in the ad hoc group in the late 1990s. I'm happy to elaborate on this further, but I think there's perhaps a logic to exploring that, but also exploring other approaches in which we could perhaps assess declarations. Another approach which might be of interest is the concept of demonstrative verification. In circumstances where it may be difficult to negotiate a multilaterally negotiated legally binding agreement, there may be other approaches or initiatives which could be done by collectives of states and really be used to demonstrate compliance through a sort of structured and systematic approach. It is also probably fair to say that irrespective of what BW states parties are able to agree here or not, in the event of allegations emerging or in the event of alleged biological weapons use, there will be actors outside of this room, outside of the BWC Convention, who will almost certainly be using decentralized open source models and applying these tools and these data sets to come to conclusions about compliance with the BWC. I think that will happen irrespective of what's done here. But it just does point to another model. And I think historically you can look for a number of ways in which open source or societal verification has played a role in the convention. I won't talk any more about this. I've had a couple of comments raised on the paper already, and I want to concede entirely on one of these. And that is, one informed commentator suggested that the costs in some of these are almost certainly an underestimate. I think that's a fair point. There was a logic to how we arrived at those costs. Looking at, for example, the verification budget in the OPCW, but there will be a number of initial costs to set that up, which I acknowledge, and yeah, I'm happy to take that on the chin. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, it's easy to fall back to traditional ideas, but also important to remember that states parties have the possibility to do something sui generis, and I think those models or those options are interesting to keep in mind. Please continue to jot down your comments or your questions or put them in the Q&A if you're joining us online. I'll get to those in a minute, but before that, I have a final question to our panelists, perhaps also to Alonso if he wants to respond, but don't worry. It's kind of moving away from the papers and to touch upon some of the recent developments. We've heard and read the chair's proposal to focus the two mechanisms of science and technology and Article 10 mechanism on the topic of verification moving forward for the next couple of years. I would like to ask you, for your views on this and particularly perhaps what implication does that have for the verification discussion. If I could start with you, Matt, and then turn to Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my personal perspective, I think it's encouraging that there are options on the table to take some actual concrete steps forward, both in terms of the individual value of an ISA mechanism or a science technology review mechanism, but also with the goal in mind of using those tools to support and benefit the really complex discussion around verification and compliance. I think the S&T mechanism in particular probably has more direct relationship to something like the compliance assessment component of the model that I discussed. But if we think about verification in the context of ensuring the implementation of all the treaty obligations, obviously international cooperation and assistance in Article 10 are a core component of that. And so I think there's also benefit in that sense, not only to facilitate the implementation of those Article 10 obligations, but also the activities that are aimed to support and develop and strengthen national implementation, whether that's through legislation and regulatory systems or building the capacities that are necessary to implement the treaty obligations at the national level. And so I think there's a broad benefit, regardless of how you look at the verification concept.
Thanks, Matt. Same question to you, Jamie, about the chair's proposal.
I can't speak to the ICA mechanisms much, but I think the S&T mechanisms, the S&T mechanism is a really important role to be played in two kind of quite distinct areas. So the first thing, this comes back to a point raised earlier, but trying to better understand threats and risks and what a BWC or BW program might look like in the future. This is a difficult discussion to have, but I think it is one that is important to at least have a clearer overview, if not going into the details. Yeah, so I think this is important to being able to focus where you want to direct your mechanism. The second is the technological options to support verification. As we've heard over the course of the week, VEREX looked at identified and evaluated 21 measures. As pointed out by others, there's been a lot that has changed since 1992 and 1993. Those 21 measures will have evolved and they will be augmented by a range of other tools and approaches that could be applied. I think assessing these potential tools that could be used now is going to require quite a diverse range of skills. Indeed, looking at risks, but also looking at technological opportunities is going to require lots of different sets of expertise. It's perhaps a reflection of my rock and roll lifestyle, but last night I went through and started looking at the participants list for VEREX to see how many people were involved. And going through that, it's clear there's more than 100 people from about 46 states, I think, depending on the session. And you go through it, there are some familiar names, but it also shows that breadth of expertise that was brought to bear in those discussions. And you will need that if you want to look at some of those technological options, and also further expertise to be able to go through and make sense of the risks. So I think that's two areas where I think there's a clear role for an S&T mechanism. Yeah. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I think you're not alone with your rock and roll lifestyle these weeks, but thank you for your comments. And I would now like to open the floor to your questions, your comments on this topic. We also, of course, welcome input from Friends of the Chair, if they wish to do so. And I think if you raise your nameplates, I'll get to you one at a time. So over to you. I think we already have one. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm plateless. Peter, so I'm asking, what would the panelists say is the biggest counter argument to, the position that, verification doesn't really make sense? And this goes back to COVID-19, because with COVID-19, there are a lot of calls from different countries to visit other countries. In case there are times when the outbreak would spiral and some countries would impose border closures on other countries, and really IHR almost altogether fell apart, yet it had provisions that, went against these things. And coming from the Global South, even more relevant, it's because there was a perception of a disproportionateness when that one, with like, yes, we shall have the measures, but for example, can country A just say, well, we want to do a challenge inspection in country B and really be respected with all its sovereignty, or will they just work one way around? So, I mean, my question to the panel is, what would be your biggest counter argument to such a point of view? Not that anyone holds that point of view.
Just hypothetically. Thank you, Peter. I think I have Austria next.
Just one big question maybe, and something that bothers me in the discussions a little bit is that we are sometimes losing sight of Article 1, which is a general purpose criterion, which clearly says everything that is has no justification for peaceful, prophylactic, and other purposes is prohibited. So this is quite a strong article, and it's probably also one of the reasons why the whole BWC is such a strong norm. So this then, and this is, I mean, we talk here about biological weapons program, but in the end, that would mean that everything that has the wrong intent is already prohibited. So if you are a peaceful scholar somewhere in a laboratory and you decide, okay, I will use that now to win the war of my country or to bring down humanity, then you're already in violation of the BWC. This does not make our task easier, but we should definitely not forget that there is a strong element of intent. Coming then to verification, that would mean that this whole work that we are doing here, be it on states, I mean, we don't have a role really on individuals that are not working under state umbrella. But in the end, what we have to do here is much more, and even with the new technological developments related to what Interpol is already doing. So it's more of a romanticized way of doing verifications with smart people in a room getting hints and putting pictures on a wall and just looking for inconsistencies. And if we then put this back to our work, and this is like with my basic knowledge, how I imagine verification is that you get different types of information. You get the declaration, then you get some other information, and you see, okay, this does not fit together. And this is the very simple way how I would see verification, and also how we could use new technology, including big data, AI analysis, where you could see hints or patterns that a normal human cannot see. Okay, this is not normal. This differs from what they have done previously in this country. This differs from all the other countries. How you see something that we see in the behavior of satellites, that is used in a very similar way. So my basic question is, am I here with this very romanticized and simple way of verification? Am I here on the wrong track, on the right track? Is the reality more complicated? So I'm very interested to hear your views, and also on the intent-based problem and how we solve that.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it sparked a lot of it will spark a lot of comments from our speakers. I think we can start with those. I see there are a number of other questions in the room. I'll get to those in a minute. Peter has asked about, well, that hypothetical question, and also he raised a point about global South concerns and challenges and questions and the issue of proportionality. Austria have made the point of the general purpose criteria, the importance of Article 10, how you can see patterns of normality out of a romanticized, perhaps, view of verification or not. I think, Jamie, I'll turn to you first, and then Matt.
Thank you for the questions. I mean, Peter, to take your question, I think we've all spoken about the extent of technological change. I think that's clearly apparent to most of us. It's the technological advancement, but it's also the convergence of technologies and then the diffusion, which is great on the one hand in addressing societal challenges and contributing to a number of useful, peaceful purposes. But I think that technological change and diffusion in the current security environment, I think, is where we start to see concern emerging, and particularly around new utilities of biological weapons, because you could start to see how this could creep into sort of a new biological arms race. And I really don't think we want to open that box, irrespective of the region, anywhere in the world. I think there's something worth trying to push back against, and in the interests of all states. Andreas, I quite like your romanticized version. I think that's a similar approach. And I also welcome any opportunity to be able to talk about the general purpose criterion under Article 1. I think it's extremely important that we don't lose sight of that intent-based, comprehensive definition that we see under Article 1. It has future-proofed the BWC extremely well, and I think it's something we should continue to guard against any attempts to chip away at that, because it is important. In terms of the vision of verification, I think I'd share a similar view to you. I think it's a collection of indicators using a growing array of tools that could be brought to bear to build a better, clearer, higher resolution picture of the activities in a state or in a facility. And from that, you can then reach an informed judgment. The more bits, the more granular pixels that you can weave into that particular picture, I think it's going to augment and help have a more informed discussion, or at least point to areas where you perhaps want to ask questions. So that's a similar view to what I would have. And I'd also echo the point, I think you do need some baseline of data which is submitted by states to start this. I think depending on which, most models will still require some form of input from states to kick the process off. So I think, yeah, declarations, CBMs, the various terms you could use, but some form of baseline will be an important starting point. Thanks.
All right, I'd like to thank both of you for your questions. I think they were excellent insight, and you highlight, obviously, several of the many complex challenges facing verification. I think I may try to answer both questions to some degree at the same time, and I think in the model that I have in mind, in which we separate verification from compliance assessment and focus verification on ensuring implementation of treaty obligations, I think that helps balance some of that, the potential disparities in the investment and the burden on states parties across geographic regions. And I think any kind of declaration or any activities around verification compliance are only going to provide an incomplete picture, right? We can't cover everything. A declaration at the national level is not going to address all the biological activities going on within that country's scope of responsibility. And so I think ensuring that the systems are in place, whether that's regulatory oversight or national legislation, culture of responsibility, programs and education to promote the positive and peaceful use for biology, helps mitigate those challenges to some degree, because we're not going to be able to necessarily detect any kind of anomaly that might signal a program that is conducting nefarious activities. And so I think you asked the question, is reality more complicated than that model? And I think it is, and I think that's the challenge that states parties are forced to deal with, and there's no easy answer to that. And I think approaching verification from a national implementation perspective helps increase that confidence, that assurance that activities are being used or biology is being used for peaceful purposes, but also providing that capability through a compliance assessment to take a closer look at specific activities or specific programs to determine whether they are operating in compliance with those treaty prohibitions under Article 1 in particular, but as well as the non-proliferation and disarmament components of Articles 2 and 3 as well.
Thank you, Matt. We had a question from the user. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Apologies for not having a nameplate. The nameplate of the EU has I don't know, been either stolen or simply disappeared, which would not deprive us anyway from taking the floor. And we are happy to contribute, even though now after those interventions, I'll just perhaps transfer my question into comments which would follow what Andreas in Austria asked about the verification. First of all, I'm really glad that that VEREX and ad hoc group was mentioned, because while the EU does not believe and see no benefits in resuming prior negotiations on the verification protocol concluded in 2001, we still do believe that perhaps there is a value to incorporate lessons learned from previous negotiations in VEREX and ad hoc group. And I really thank Dr. Revel for providing us and walking us through the different models of verification. Andreas was talking about romanticism and perhaps imagining how the verification process or verification regime should look like. I have a more simplified idea that I'll take. Listening to the discussion we have in the working group, we always are pretty much clear about what's the input and what's the output of the verification process. So it's kind of declarations, which Dr. Revel mentioned can be national declarations or CBMs. Then there is something, many countries calling it toolbox, to verify what's in the declaration, which should produce some kind of outcome that, yes, these activities are in line with the BWC or are not in line, and should trigger the next perhaps step, which could be a challenge inspections. And we also discussed that science and technology now can contribute to biological weapons program and simplify biological weapons program. So I would like to know how we can turn it around, how we can make artificial intelligence our friend in terms of verification. So I'm sure that many countries would like to apply artificial intelligence to verify the input declarations, but then how we can further harness the artificial intelligence benefits for the verification purposes, and how those artificial intelligence tools can fit in the toolbox we are talking about, in which model that were presented by UNIDIR we can include it in any model, or maybe a demonstrative verification model. What kind of model we can think about when we want to include artificial intelligence in our benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were two questions in the back, I think India and Switzerland.
Thank you, UNIDIR, for organizing this very important side event, and it helps us to think further on issues that we're discussing formally in the group. And I'd also like to thank the panelists for sharing very good perspectives, and also Jamie's paper that he contributed to the FAS, which was read with great interest by my delegation, so that is appreciated. I have one short question, which is that the BWC is essentially an arms control instrument between states, and that it's a disarmament instrument between states. It's an intergovernmental instrument, but what we see essentially a large part of risk that comes. Also, what Jamie said was the proliferation of do-it-yourself biology and of the rapid advancements in science and technology, that some of the risks that we are talking of would not come from states by themselves. They would come from perhaps from non-state actors. Now, when you look at non-state actors, you're essentially looking either at proliferation tools that you have, 1540, and national implementation. These are the only tools that you have to deal with that. And the verification, if you do essentially for the BWC, would cover state compliance with these, with the convention, and that would not cover a vector of threat which will stay unaddressed. So, and also that if states do have hypothetically a program for for biological weapons, because of which we are discussing about compliance and verification, they might conceal that under a program of a non-state actor. So we would like to understand from you how verification could, for instance, facilitate or implicate or would have implications to that vector of threat that arises from actors which are not covered under the Biological Weapons Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's quite a lot. So if with your indulgence, I'll take your question in the next round. I'm sorry. Perhaps, Matt, I can start with you for those questions. There was a question about AI, how we can make it our friend. I would also say harness its power and minimize the challenges. And also India about how verification or the BWC can deal with non-state actors' risk. Over to you.
Thank you. First, I will readily admit I am not an expert in AI. I know enough about it to get myself into trouble, but that's really about it. I would say a couple of considerations that popped into mind. One, Maria mentioned mitigating the risks of AI as well, and obviously that has a role in national legislation and regulatory systems that fall under the national implementation of treaty obligations, and I think that's important. Also, I think one challenge is that if we don't have a model biological weapons program in mind to train those AI tools to look for, because bioweapons programs can look like so many different forms. There are additional challenges so that those tools know what they're supposed to be looking for, rather than flagging anomalies that might be unrelated to offensive biological activities. But I also think there are additional opportunities to leverage AI to help states parties compile their declarations, because there's so many activities going on and so many and programs both within and outside of government. It might be a tool to help pull and compile that information so that they can submit more accurate and more effective declarations if that is something that is implemented in the future. And to the question from, I believe it was India, with respect to ensure protections against programs and risks that are outside of government. Again, I want to keep kind of going back to the national implementation component, whether that's through regulatory oversight, whether that's through national legislation that implements treaty prohibitions at the national level, things like codes of conduct or establishing educational programs to build cultures of responsibility, all help address those risks to some degree outside of state government programs. And obviously there are obligations under Articles 3 and 4 that states parties should take actions to mitigate those proliferation risks, even if it's not necessarily state to state. So I think to me, focusing on ensuring the appropriate and effective implementation of all those obligations, whether it's for Article 1 specifically, or focus more on things like Article 3 or other Article 10, Article 7, by ensuring the effective implementation of those obligations can raise assurance and build confidence and trust that activities within the broad scope of biology at all levels, whether it's in state government programs or in academic programs or the private sector and business and industry, I think building the confidence that all those protections are in place can help mitigate those risks and provide assurance to other states parties that those biological activities are legitimate.
Yeah, just a couple of points if I can respond to Igor first of all. Thank you for the encouraging words. Just on the protocol, I mean, I think we should recognize there's a lot of time, a lot of energy has been invested in developing this. I mean, my calculations, I think it was about 332 working days of meetings that were spent over the course of the protocol, the ad hoc group, I should say. And there's some 450 odd published papers or working papers that were submitted to that. So there's a lot of work gone into it. And I don't think we can just ignore that. But I think there's general recognition we need to look at changes in science at the very least. And I think in many ways that it would be very difficult to go back to that, given that there are essentially two versions of the protocol. One, composite text, CRP8, had at least 87 known issues with that text. And the rolling text on which composite text was based also has many, many brackets. So I think there's difficulties there, but there are bits that could still be a lot that can be learned from there. In terms of the AI question, As you probably realize by now, I think I have AI fatigue, so I'm surprised it took this long for AI to be raised in the discussion. I think there's a lot of things that you could theoretically task this to do, detecting anomalies in trade flows, financial flows, anomalies in satellite surveillance photos or facility information. There's a lot of ways you could apply it. There's two things, though, which are a blockage on this. First, I think you need accurate, reliable, credible details on past programs in order to inform the algorithm and help it sort of actually begin to detect what would an anomaly would look like linked to a biological weapons program. And whilst we have some information, in many cases it may be very good, there's also a lot of, I think, a colleague of mine, Julian Perry-Robinson, used to talk about gaps, lies, and spin and omissions in relation to the history of BW programs. And I think there's still that challenge. And then again, what does a biological weapons program look like today, I think is another challenge. And I think if you could figure that out, then I think AI could be tasked to do more. I think, thank you again for the question and the encouragement. On DIY, I think DIY, we have iGEM, we have a sort of growing citizen science movement. This is all a good thing. Incidentally, I mean, the DIY bio movement, I think, started off with a couple of people in a pub in Boston in 2007. And that was it. It's since evolved, and you have hundreds of DIY bio groups of different forms. I've had limited interaction in actual going to these sort of places, but my one experience of going to a DIY bio facility was that actually they'd taken some of these points into consideration. They had a biosafety officer, they had a code of conduct pinned up on the wall, they had a number of measures that had put in place. I don't think I can generalize on that, but I think there is some thinking around this which is important to keep in mind. But you raise an important point. I think the BWC is somewhat of a limited instrument in dealing with those actors from outside of government, but I think it does come down to implementation. I think Matt made this point very well, implementation of the BWC and continuing to make sure that that is kept up to date and is fit for purpose in terms of dealing with these challenges. But you raise a good point. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Switzerland, please, the floor is yours. Apologies for the delay.
Thank you very much to UNIDIR for this very insightful presentation or panel. Something that struck me, I think it was Jamie citing Jess's position on verification, was the idea that the potential verification regime wouldn't need to be equitable or reciprocal. This is something that we are obviously not discussing here in the working group because it might be a very hot political sell. But I was wondering on the views of the panel if there would be value in further exploring this idea and also how this could influence the discussions we are having inside the working group. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure we can speak for the authors, but maybe there are some insights. Mali, you had the floor, ma'am.
So thank you very much. I have just one question. So regarding this ongoing design of the verification mechanism under BWC, I want to know how and what could be the benefits on this from of country who which have not yet more developed in terms of science and development, and a country where we have an insecurity issue, how we are going to take benefit of this verification process. Because for me, when you talk during discussion, some state party mentioned inspection. You can do inspection. Inspection is based from something really defined before. And in some country, I invite you to think more on evaluation, assessment of risk. Because when you know the risk, at where the biological agents are handling, you have to be sure that the component of biosecurity are well implement it. And then the other things is like we need to be sure that science and technology, the dual use researches, all those things are going well in the insecurity context and with the pressure of development. So are we going to use the same approach to assess those countries who already define, who already have in the past time about a bioweapons program, and those countries who don't have the bioweapons program declared before and who are dealing with the daily insecurity and science and development, medical issue in terms of public health, animal health, environmental health sector. So I invite you to see, and what do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you make an important point that also ties to the first question we have. So there was a question about Jess's perspective on this, on equitable or reciprocal aspects of verification system, as well as the benefit for developing countries of such a system, how to evaluate risk and how to do it when there are competing priorities in a country. Jamie, if I could start with you, then I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you, Lauren, for that particular question. That's very much appreciated. I can't really answer that, but I should also probably be very clear that the views in the report are not necessarily those of UNIDIR or the UN, but they are the personal perspectives, and we wanted to have something to stimulate thinking, and it's clearly done that. Thank you for raising that. Kadiatu, I think the point you raised kind of gets back to a wider issue that we're going to see, I think, on the BWC, whether it's verification, whether it's national implementation, biosecurity, biosafety. I think it will need to be part of some sort of balanced package of measures that make sure there are incentives to participate for states all across the world, because there may be many who do not prioritize biological weapons for very logical reasons. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and points to the importance of ICA mechanisms, but also continued work on international cooperation through Article 10 as well. But yeah, thanks.
First, thank you. I see you smiling back there. I don't have an answer to the question about whether the verification can be inequitable or non-reciprocal. I'd really have to think about that. I don't have a good answer one way or another, so I'll have to think about that, and maybe I can follow up with you at a later date. With respect to the question from Molly about benefits for developing countries or countries that don't necessarily have the capacities, whether that's for national implementation or broader biosafety, biosecurity. I think one of the things that I was thinking about in this when I was playing around with this model, this alternative model of verification and compliance, is that tying compliance assessment to treaty implementation, I think it's potentially problematic, because there are states parties that don't have necessarily the capacities that would be needed to implement the treaty in the way that all states parties want all other states parties to be implementing it. And the risk of judging a state party as being non-compliant because they don't have biosafety or biosecurity or national legislation in place, I think is problematic. And for me, I think the goal of verification should be to help states parties get to that point where their treaty obligations are implemented fully. And I think going through a process that helps states parties identify those gaps and help states parties identify targets for international cooperation and assistance to build capacities related to things like biosecurity, with national legislation, oversight, and all this, obviously all the secondary benefits of those to the broader use of biology and biotechnology, I think is really what I had envisioned. And so not risking or not viewing verification as an opportunity for admonishment or punishment, but using it as a way to work toward that full implementation for all the benefits of all the states parties.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, completely agree with that. I think we have China, and I don't see any more flags raised, but please let me know.
You. First, thank you very much for hosting this event. We extremely welcome such opportunity to actually have a discussion on this very important topic in a different setting from the room that we were just in, and to have different opinions from expertise to give us some fresh new ideas. And I think the statistics that Jamie just gave us about the VEREX process and ad hoc working group just speak to the much more efforts that we would need to invest to the process that we are having now to have a answer to the, I think we would all agree, very difficult question of the verification mechanism in BWC. And a specific question I'm having, and I think is also a hot debated question in this process, is about routine inspection. We have been hearing views about how impossible it would be to conduct routine inspection because of the dual use nature of bioactivities, because of the large scale of bioindustry, and maybe because of the financial burdens that would bring. We are actually open to this idea, but personally, I would very much like to hear the views from experts on this element, whether it is an element that is absolutely not impossible to be incorporated in the verification mechanism that we are envisaging here for BWC. And I think a related question is about the focus on the high containment facilities. If we only focus on the high containment facilities, would it be sufficient enough to address the diverse threats that we are facing now? I think this question is also somehow related to the question posed by our Indian colleagues. So that will be it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this moment? If not, we have two very interesting questions. The first one related to routine inspections, or as Jamie said before, rebranded to visits. So I want to hear more about that and that process, and what are the prospects for today's age. And the focus on high containment facilities, is it enough? Jamie, perhaps I could start with you and turn to you, Matt.
Yeah, many thanks, Wenwen, for the question. I think just on VEREX and the ad hoc group, we actually did some calculations on the cost, the time, and a number of things around both VEREX and the ad hoc group, and it is quite significant, worth keeping in mind. On the issue of visits, as Maria reminded us and mentioned before, I think there was a realization that we shouldn't use that in the protocol negotiations. It seems there was a shift from the use of the term inspections to visits because they didn't want or wanted to have a distinction between what was being done in OPCW and what was being attempted to be developed in the protocol negotiations. So there was this shift, and then a range of different types. I think there was 6 different sorts of visits were raised over the course of the protocol negotiations. As it sort of ended up, I think there was an expectation of doing, I think it was 120 visits each calendar year in the protocol discussions, and that was to assess what scholars calculated based on CBMs as being between 1,600 and 3,200 declarable facilities around the world in, I think, 97 or 98. That's a statistic based on CBM submissions, and the average number, which I think Graham, the late Graham Pearson put together. I can share more information with you on that. So that was the thinking then. I think there's 2 dynamics. Certainly, I think has been pointed out in discussions, there are many more facilities. And it's not just BSL 4 or even BSL 3. I think there's much, the dynamics are such that you can do much more within smaller, lower level facilities should you choose to. So I think it is a real challenge. At the same time, if you point to some of the discussions, I draw from the discussion around visits in relation to peer review, for example. There is a sense that sometimes these can be useful in building confidence based on the reports that we've seen of these. But I suggest it's probably going to be very difficult to tell. One thing that was done, there's quite a lot of done in protocol negotiations. I know the UK and Brazil did this. I think the Netherlands were involved in this process as well, is almost a trial of inspections and visits to see whether this is feasible. So it strikes me perhaps as a future step, and I'm conscious Alonso is here and probably not looking for additional work at this particular stage, but something to consider if we do want to take this forward is what we're talking about these in a very abstract concept, or talking about these based on what was the thinking 20, 30 years ago. Could we find some way of exploring that and at least having a better understanding and a more informed discussion? And how many facilities would we realistically need to look at? I think it all comes back to what's the problem. And then at least it becomes a bit less of an abstract argument maybe, or you have a more constructive sense, because it may be that they don't work at all and they aren't of any value, but you're not going to find that out without at least having some sort of trial or some sort of test. Could be useful to consider. It's my personal view on this. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think they're really important issues to address, and I think to some degree, I think my response to both of them will come down to what we're trying to accomplish with these visits or inspections or whatever we want to call them. I mean, if it's something where we're trying to detect noncompliance, that's a very different issue than if we're trying to understand how states parties are implementing their treaty obligations. Obviously, we discussed before, there's too many labs, there's too many biological activities going around the world, so that a limited number of inspections, the chance of identifying noncompliance is probably low. Now, there's obviously deterrence value in that as well, but if we're trying to understand and ensure that states parties and state governments are taking their obligations seriously to ensure that the appropriate protections are in place, I think that's a very different issue, and I think there is value in that approach. In terms of the focus on high containment facilities, I think in some cases there's dangerous pathogens that aren't handled at the BSL-4 level. And in some cases, it depends on the activity you're doing. A diagnostic test might be at a much lower BSL-4, the containment level, versus a culture versus manipulating a genome. And so it depends on the activity, sometimes more so than the pathogen itself. And so I think a focus on trying to use inspections or visits of those high containment laboratories to detect prohibited or nefarious activity, I think is probably limited. But if we're talking about, again, ensuring that the protections are in place and that the systems are functioning properly to provide protections across a broad scope of activities, both within government and outside of government, I think that, again, has value in increasing that confidence and insurance that states parties are taking their obligations seriously, which I think provides a broad value in mitigating the risks and concern about biological weapons.
Thank you very much, Matt. Is there? Please go ahead.
Wanted to jump into this discussion because it's highly important, and it's what we are discussing very heatedly in the room currently. And I think if we talk about on-site inspections, the purpose are broader than just finding out if there's non-compliance or not. I mean, something that I mentioned today, there is the issue of training, there is the issue of transparency, there is the issue of just seeing that whatever has been submitted by declaration is coherent. Then there is also a very clear reason why such inspection should be doing. But the problem is many of those issues are currently be done by the WHO, because obviously no one should have access to smallpox samples for militarizing them or using them or I don't know, put them into their synthetic biology program or whatever they are having. Those are in high level security facilities. The WHO regularly is visiting the two facilities that are having the samples of smallpox. So obviously there is a high risk, and it's also maybe in the future one of the tasks of this mechanism to make sure that they are secured against theft or other issues. So this is also one of the reasons why we should go to high-level facilities. It's not just, okay, they are not having a biological military program. There's so much more to it, and I think we should not lose sight of these many extra benefits that are there, even if we don't see everything that a country or are absolutely unable to see everything that a country is doing, and just also getting our stuff together, seeing what they are doing also the most important, I forgot it, it was the most important point that I wanted to make. It's the human-to-human interaction. And when we talked with the OPCW experts, they said this is the most important element. Talking to a human, seeing his reaction if you confront him about something, seeing is this really the case, what they put into their documents, is there coherence to the story? And this brings me back to my detective romance or a Netflix series with Daniel Fix, based on Daniel Fix's role here in the BWC. I mean, this is the work that in the end inspectors should be doing. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd love to keep the conversation going. So I do have an online question, but I'm going to stick with the room. So Peter, do you want to go ahead?
Much. So now I'm speaking purely as a scientist. It's typically when we investigate outbreaks, for example, if you're doing wastewater surveillance and you detect there's strange pathogens which you think might be engineered, if you're doing public health work, it's really cut and dry. You submit your data and work goes on. But I've noticed with things that have to do with diplomacy, there's now this whole other level of like letters and not verbales and evidence, and do you go to Security Council? Do you get an appointment in that meeting? So if really, for example, I detect in wastewater coming from country A that there is evidence of biological manipulation of material or basically engineered pathogens in their wastewater, are the mechanisms that we are talking about now, the inspections and all that stuff, will they really even help if, someone says, oh yeah, that's all well and good, but maybe that was not under the annex of, what we agreed upon as a verifiable source of this and that. So sometimes I feel like at the point at which science tries to help the diplomats, there'll be all this other like red tape that will invalidate like 90% of what would have been evidence or plausible cause for the things you've been talking about. So it really baffles my head a little bit how the two will now work together. Over.
Thank you so much. I think that this speaks to the importance of having different expertise in the room, including scientists. I'll turn to the speakers. I'm conscious of time to answer to those questions. And perhaps also if I could ask you to wrap up our discussion as well, if you have any closing thoughts, and perhaps what next steps states parties could consider moving forward in this discussion. So we can give a nice closing to this conversation. Jamie, I think I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Thanks for the questions. Andreas, I think that could be a Netflix top 10 with sort of Daniel driving around in a mobile lab or something. I think you're right. There's a number of functions that you could envisage these sort of visits playing, which could augment that central role. So I think in OPCW, you have the function of checking the accuracy of a declaration. But I think it also can help you get an insight of the relationship between the people in the facility and the government and their awareness of some of these tools and institutes. And those human social points, I think, would make a really good point there. So I think there's things there. Drawing a little bit historically as well, I think in 97, 98, again, the Brazil visits, I should say, part of that also involved a cooperative element. So there was a discussion on checking or having a discussion on, it was a sort of trial, but then augmented to that was actually, well, here's how we do things and perhaps that cooperative aspect. So I think there's potentially thinking about how that could be integrated in, which comes back to the point that you were raising earlier, I think. Yeah, so I think that there are functions, but you need to work out whether it's cost efficient and actually going to help. Peter, yeah, there's lots of exciting technologies and tools and opportunities, but they need to be accompanied by procedures, and there will undoubtedly be red tape, which is perhaps the title of the Netflix series there. But it will be, there always needs to be that sort of development of measures and procedures, and they need to be agreed, and I think that's going to be important. Experience in trilaterals and other measures has really pointed to that as well. In terms of your question, Maria, on topics, I think finding greater convergence around function and focus. Another point is I think we need to start taking some of this discussion back to capitals, take it back home and getting a sense of response to national perspectives around this. What do different departments, what does industry or private sector actors think of this sort of ideas? It's worth recalling the ad hoc group did do a survey of states parties in which they tried to figure out what facilities there are, what sort of responses. So I think that could be useful. If we're going to use the S&T mechanism to look at verification, then what sort of questions do you want to put to that? What sort of ways can you actually get them to constructively engage with that? Again, in Verex, I think it used the causative agent of Q fever, but maybe there are other things, other ways which you want to select what tests could be looked at. And then, as I mentioned, perhaps looking to trial and see whether some of these tools can be useful. And with that, just thank you very much to all of you for joining us on my side, and I'll mute myself now, but thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I think you made the point I was trying to make about the purpose of inspections and the value of inspections much more eloquently than I did. And I think there are a broad range of values for inspections and site visits. And I think states parties should keep that in mind, that there's not just this one purpose, but it has value. And Jamie outlined some of them as well. Peter, to your question, I think that's the challenge, right? Is to how to balance the technical and the political aspects of these. And I think in terms of any kind of investigation, really it starts as objective, like the event itself is objective, but as you move along in the investigation process to sampling and analysis and conclusions, and then at the far end, the determination by state governments, it gets more subjective and more political as you go along. And that's an inevitable challenge that states parties need to keep in mind, particularly as they try to figure out what these procedures and processes and standards are that would factor into implementing a verification or compliance assessment regime within the BWC. I think just a quick note on next steps. As I mentioned, the purpose of our original BWC assurance study was to address issues around the scope and the purpose of verification, and to hopefully stimulate some conversation about that in anticipation that states parties would be addressing it during this current intersessional program. And it's great to hear states parties are grappling with those questions now. And I think that the next step is moving toward a common understanding of what the goals, the scope and the purpose of verification are. In some way, if states parties want to eventually agree to any kind of legally binding document and a verification regime in any capacity in the BWC, they need to know what that endpoint is that they're negotiating toward. And if states parties are negotiating toward various different endpoints, the chances and the probability of reaching any of them are pretty low. And so I think trying to get on the same page, or at least in the same general vicinity in terms of what states parties want out of verification and what it's supposed to address, I think is going to be a key next step. And hopefully they can take steps toward more detailed and can concrete discussions on what that means now that they're asking the questions.
Thank you, Matt. Alonso, I would like to ask you if you have any closing thoughts to wrap up the panel.
Well, thank you so much again for organizing this seminar. I think this is some of the creative ideas that will be needed moving forward when considering the topics of verification of compliance. I think here from the presentations, we clearly have seen the need to develop the conceptual understandings of terms of verification, but also their interrelationship with other essential issues like compliance and transparency, and that they will need to be further developed and understood in our way forward. I think also there was a lot of discussions on the need for on-site and off-site tools that will, and the need to frame them in a way that serve different but defined purposes, I think. And this for the endpoint that you have mentioned, that they're not just measures for the sake of the measures themselves, but they are measures for the sake of particular purposes. I think also within the discussions there was clearly an understanding that there are that even tools might have different approaches for national security purposes and for public health purposes. And obviously they each have differentiated efforts, but there might also be some touching points and national implementation and other aspects. And I think all this. And I think also the need to understand the need of both need to develop anticipatory measures kind of preventive, anticipatory measures, but also other measures that are more reactive. And also, I think this kind of different conceptualization of measures will be important. So thank you so much for these inputs, which I think will certainly enrich our discussions.
Thank you very much, Alonso. So with that, I'm afraid we need to wrap up. It seems like we've fallen a little bit short on time, which I think speaks about the interest that there is about this topic. It was super interesting to me to hear the panelists. I hope it was for you as well. Before we close, if I could please encourage you to fill in our feedback form. They are just outside or online in the chat. This helps us moving forward with our next events. It just takes a couple of minutes. I would like to thank our speakers today and our colleagues that helped out with the production of this event, Luisa and Luison. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope you have a really good Friday evening, a really good weekend, and that you come with new energy for next week's discussion. Thank you very much.